March 17, 1945. The Moselle Valley, eastern France. Captain Franz Hartmann stood in the stone doorway of what had been the mayor's office, watching smoke rise from distant hills where the American advance continued its methodical progress eastward. Behind him, his executive officer Major Klaus Brenner was reading the order for the third time, as if repetition might somehow change the words on the paper. Outside, the men of the 416th Grenadier Battalion waited in the town square, their faces carrying that particular exhaustion that comes not from marching or fighting, but from the slow realization that everything they had believed was coming apart. The order was brief, precise, clinical in its language. All structures of military or economic value were to be destroyed. Roads mined. Bridges demolished. Livestock slaughtered. Food stores burned. The town of Breitenbach, population 847, was to be rendered useless to the advancing enemy. The directive came from Corps headquarters, stamped with the authority of the Führer's scorched-earth decree issued 6 weeks earlier. Everything that could not be held was to be denied to the enemy, even if it meant reducing German soil itself to ash. Hartmann had received many orders during 4 years of war. He had followed them across Poland, through Russia, back across the Reich's shrinking borders. He had ordered men into attacks he knew were pointless, held positions that couldn't be held, executed maneuvers that served no strategic purpose beyond delaying the inevitable. But this order was different. It asked him to destroy what he was supposed to protect. The town spread below them, nestled in a valley where the river bent through farmland that had been cultivated for 1,000 years. Red-tiled roofs caught the late afternoon light. Church spires rose above narrow streets where generations had lived, married, died, been buried. In the fields, old men and boys worked plows in soil that would soon need planting. Women carried water from wells their grandmothers had drawn from. This was not enemy territory. This was Germany itself. Major Brenner set the order down carefully, as if the paper itself might be dangerous. They can't expect us to. They expect exactly that, Hartmann interrupted quietly. The order is clear. In the square below, Sergeant Wilhelm Kessler was directing men to stack equipment. At 43, Kessler was old for his rank, a veteran of the Great War who had been called up again in 1939. He moved with the economical efficiency of a man who had spent too much time in uniform, wasting no motion, offering no complaint. But Hartmann had seen him talking with the civilians that morning, accepting fresh bread from a widow whose husband had fallen at Kursk. The 416th was not an elite unit. They were reservists and recovering wounded, men deemed too old or too damaged for frontline service but still useful for occupation duties. They had been stationed in Breitenbach for 6 weeks, billeted in homes where they ate at family tables and learned the names of children. Lieutenant Schmidt's men had helped repair the sawmill damaged by winter storms. Corporal Dieter had assisted the town doctor with medical supplies requisitioned from army stores. These were not abstract military objectives. They were people. Young Lieutenant Hans Weber appeared in the doorway, saluting automatically despite the informality of the headquarters. At 22, he was the youngest officer in the battalion, still carrying the idealism that 4 years of war hadn't quite extinguished. The demolition teams are ready, Herr Hauptmann. We await your orders. Hartmann didn't turn from the window. Tell me, Weber. What do you think those orders should be? Weber hesitated, his military training warring with whatever he was actually thinking. The order is explicit, sir. That wasn't my question. The younger officer was quiet for a long moment. Outside, children were playing in the street, their voices carrying through the cool air. My brother died at Stalingrad, Weber said finally. I was told he died defending the fatherland. But if we burn the fatherland itself, what did he die for? It was the question everyone was thinking but few dared to speak. The logic of total war had become so consuming that it had turned against itself, devouring the very thing it claimed to protect. Destroy the village to save it. Burn the country to defend it. The contradictions had become so obvious that even young lieutenants could see them. Major Brenner cleared his throat. There are procedures for questioning orders, Hauptmann. Proper channels. And how long do proper channels take? Hartmann asked. Hours? Days? The Americans will be here tomorrow. Maybe tonight. Then we should begin, Brenner said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Hartmann finally turned from the window. His uniform was clean but showed its age, buttons replaced, patches sewn over worn spots, the insignia of ranks he'd been promoted through and demoted from over 4 years. At 36, he looked older. They all did. The war had a way of aging men faster than time alone could manage. Sergeant Kessler, he called down to the square. A word, please. While Kessler climbed the stone steps, Hartmann looked at the order again. The paper was of good quality, the typing precise, the stamps official. Everything about it spoke of legitimacy, of authority, of the machinery of military command functioning exactly as it was designed to. But there was one thing the paper didn't contain, any explanation of why. Why burn homes when the enemy would occupy them anyway? Why destroy food when your own people were starving? Why render your own land uninhabitable? Kessler entered without saluting, reading the room's tension immediately. He'd been through enough to know when officers were struggling with something they couldn't easily say. Sergeant, Hartmann began. You fought in the last war. You saw what happened when we were driven back across our own territory. I did, sir. Did we burn our own villages then? No, sir. We did not. And did that cost us the war? Kessler was quiet, understanding where this was going but unwilling to speak at first. That was wise. Some things had to be said by officers. Hartmann held up the order. This directs us to destroy everything of value in Breitenbach. Food stores, fuel depots, the bridge, the mill. Every structure that might provide shelter or sustenance. Yes, sir. What would your sons think of that, Sergeant? If they knew their father had burned German homes? It was a dangerous question, one that touched the heart of what they were all feeling. Kessler had 3 sons, one dead at Kursk, one still fighting in the west, one barely 16 and likely to be conscripted any day. What future were they fighting for if Germany itself ceased to exist? Sir, I believe my sons would want there to be something left for them to come home to, Kessler said carefully. Hartmann nodded. He walked to the window again, looking down at the town. An old woman was hanging laundry in a small garden. 2 girls were carrying buckets from the well. A man with one leg, probably a veteran, was sweeping the front of a shop. Normal life, continuing despite everything, stubborn in its refusal to end. Gentlemen, Hartmann said quietly. I'm going to ask you something I have no right to ask. Something that could cost us all our lives. No one spoke. The room had gone very still. I'm going to ask you to help me disobey this order. The silence that followed was heavier than any bombardment Hartmann had endured. He had said it. The words couldn't be taken back. In speaking them aloud, he had crossed a line that military law made absolutely clear: refusal to obey a direct order in wartime was punishable by death. Not imprisonment. Not discharge. Death. Major Brenner stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He was older than Hartmann, had been in uniform longer, had more to lose. His family estate was in East Prussia, probably already overrun by the Soviets. His wife and daughter were refugees somewhere, if they were still alive. Everything he had fought for was already gone. All that remained was duty, the rigid framework that had held his world together when everything else collapsed. You're asking us to commit treason, Brenner said. Not angry. Just stating fact. I'm asking us to remember who we're supposed to be defending. The order comes from Corps headquarters. The order is insane, Hartmann said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge now. We've followed insane orders before. We've attacked positions we couldn't take. Held lines we couldn't hold. Retreated too late and advanced too early. I've lost good men to stupidity and incompetence and ego. But I've never been ordered to destroy Germany itself. Weber was standing by the door, his hand on his pistol holster not in threat but in unconscious nervous habit. What are you proposing exactly, sir? I'm proposing we delay. We report that we've begun demolition but that the work is difficult, time-consuming. We need another day. Perhaps 2. By then the Americans will be here and the question becomes moot. And if Corps sends inspectors? Brenner asked. If they discover we've done nothing? Then we answer for it, Hartmann said simply. But the town will still be standing. Sergeant Kessler spoke then, his voice carrying the weight of 26 years in uniform. Begging your pardon, Herr Hauptmann, but the men will follow you. They've been sleeping in these people's homes. Eating their food. The corporal's daughter plays with the baker's little girl. We're not going to burn that child's home. Not for any order. It was remarkable how simple it sounded when spoken plainly. We will not. 3 words that overturned the entire structure of military discipline that had bound them together through 4 years of war. But Kessler was right, the men would follow. They had already made the choice in their hearts. They were only waiting for an officer to give voice to it. Major Brenner, Hartmann said. I need to know if you're with us. Brenner stood looking at the order on the desk. His hands were behind his back, his posture rigid with the discipline of 30 years of service. Everything in his training, his background, his understanding of duty told him to refuse. To report Hartmann to higher command. To save the chain of command even if it meant destroying the town. My father was a Prussian officer, Brenner said slowly. He taught me that obedience was the highest virtue. That without discipline, an army is merely a mob. He paused, his jaw tight. But he also taught me that an officer's first duty is to his men and the people they serve. Not to papers. Not to headquarters staff who issue orders they'll never have to execute. To people. He picked up the order and tore it precisely in half. We delay. We report difficulties. And when the Americans come, we surrender this town intact. He looked at Hartmann. Then we take whatever punishment comes. The relief Hartmann felt was immediate but far from complete. They had made the decision, but the consequences remained. In the Wehrmacht of March 1945, disobeying orders meant facing courts-martial presided over by officers who were hanging soldiers for far less. Deserters were shot. Defeatists were executed. Those who questioned the Führer's infallibility were dealt with swiftly and publicly, their deaths meant as warnings. But there was something else at work now, something Hartmann hadn't fully understood until this moment. It wasn't just about one town. It wasn't even about one battalion's choice. It was about reclaiming something they had surrendered piece by piece over the past 4 years, the ability to see clearly, to judge between right and wrong, to choose based on conscience rather than command. Lieutenant Weber, Hartmann said. Assemble the officers. Everyone above platoon level. We need to explain this to them before we proceed. 20 minutes later, 16 officers stood in the town hall. They ranged from Weber's 22 years to Captain Richter's 51. Some were professionals who had spent decades in uniform. Others were civilians pressed into service, teachers and accountants and shopkeepers who had learned military command through necessity. Each face showed the same exhaustion, the same quiet desperation of men who had followed orders until orders stopped making sense. Hartmann told them everything. The order. His decision. The consequences they all faced if they followed him. He didn't try to persuade or inspire. He simply laid out the facts and asked each man to choose. One by one, they agreed. Not enthusiastically. Not defiantly. Simply with the quiet acknowledgement that some things mattered more than military discipline. Lieutenant Schwartz, whose family had lived in the region for 3 centuries, said only, "My grandfather would haunt me if I burned his birthplace." Captain Richter, the oldest, mentioned his daughter who had died in the Dresden firestorm the month before. "I will not create more fire," he said. Only one officer objected, Lieutenant Muller, a political officer attached to the battalion 2 months earlier. He was party member, a true believer who still spoke of final victory and wonder weapons. He stood rigid, outraged by what he was hearing. "This is treason," Muller said, his voice rising. "Clear treason. I'm duty-bound to report this to Corps immediately." "You're welcome to try," Hartmann said calmly. "But the radio is in this building, and you're not leaving it." Muller's hand moved toward his sidearm. He never completed the motion. Sergeant Kessler was suddenly behind him, one massive hand wrapped around the lieutenant's wrist, the other removing the pistol with practiced efficiency. "Begging your pardon, Herr Lieutenant," Kessler said. "But you're going to sit quietly in the cellar until this is over." They locked Muller in the wine cellar, still protesting, still threatening courts-martial and execution. His voice echoed up through the floorboards for an hour before it finally faded to silence. Hartmann wondered if history would judge Muller the only honorable man among them, the sole officer who remained true to his oath when everyone else broke theirs. But looking at the town through the window, watching civilians go about their evening routines unaware of what had nearly happened, Hartmann couldn't bring himself to regret the choice. The men were told that night. Hartmann gathered the battalion in the square and explained simply and directly what they were doing and why. He didn't dress it up with noble language or patriotic sentiment. He told them they were disobeying orders, that they could face execution, and that any man who wanted to leave was free to do so without consequence. No one left. Private Koch, barely 18, spoke up. "Sir, my mother is in Cologne. Or she was before the city was bombed. I don't know if she's alive. But if she is, and if some German unit has to choose whether to burn what's left of her home, I hope to God they choose what we're choosing." That sentiment rippled through the ranks. These men had families scattered across a Reich that was being reduced to rubble. Every town they spared was potentially the town where their own mothers, sisters, daughters might be sheltering. The logic was simple and impossible to refute. That night, Hartmann radioed Corps headquarters. He reported that demolition preparations had begun but were encountering difficulties. The bridge was more substantially built than expected, requiring additional explosives they didn't have. The fuel depot was too close to civilian structures, making safe demolition complex. They needed another 2 days. The response came within an hour. Proceed with maximum speed. Complete demolition by dawn March 19th. No exceptions. March 19th. The Americans would certainly be here by then. The order had bought them time, but only just enough. In the town, life continued with a strange normality. The civilians knew something had changed. Soldiers who had been preparing demolition charges the day before were now helping repair fences and clear drainage ditches. But no one asked questions. Perhaps they understood instinctively that some mercies were better left unspoken. The widow Frau Eisner, whose husband had fallen at El Alamein, brought bread to the headquarters that evening. She placed it on Hartmann's desk without a word, then looked him in the eye. "My mother lived through the last war," she said quietly. "She used to say that in war, the worst crime isn't violence. It's unnecessary violence." Then she left, her wooden shoes echoing on the stone steps. That night, Hartmann couldn't sleep. He kept imagining the report that would go to Corps the next day. Kept seeing the court-martial, the firing squad. They had procedures for executing officers who disobeyed orders. Quick. Efficient. Meant to terrify others into obedience. He wondered if he had the courage to face it without breaking. Wondered if dying for a decision might somehow validate it, give it meaning. Major Brenner found him on the steps of the church at midnight, smoking one of the American cigarettes they'd captured from a supply truck. "Having regrets?" Brenner asked. "Constant ones," Hartmann admitted. "But not about this." "I was thinking about my daughter," Brenner said. "She's 7 now. If she survives this war, what do I want her to know about what her father did? Do I want her to know I followed orders until I burned Germany itself? Or do I want her to know that at least once, I chose correctly? Assuming we survive to tell her. If we don't, someone else will. Stories have a way of surviving even when the people in them don't." March 18th arrived with cold rain that turned the square to mud and made the distant sound of artillery seem closer than it was. American forces were less than 15 kilometers away, their advance methodical, professional, inevitable. In the Wehrmacht situation rooms, officers moved pins on maps that no longer corresponded to reality. Divisions existed on paper that had ceased to exist in the field. The 416th Grenadier Battalion was scheduled to withdraw across the Rhine tomorrow, joining the defensive positions that probably wouldn't exist by the time they arrived. But the 416th wasn't moving. Hartmann had radioed Corps again, reporting continued difficulties with demolition, requesting extended timeline, knowing that each hour delayed meant 1 hour closer to the American arrival that would make all of this moot. At 0800 hours, the response came. Not via radio but in person. A staff car arrived in the square, mud-splattered and bearing the pennant of Corps headquarters. From it emerged Oberst Heinrich Vogel, a lean man in his 50s with the Knight's Cross at his throat and eyes that had seen too many retreats. He was accompanied by 2 military police and a captain from the Feldgendarmerie whose presence suggested this was not a routine inspection. Hartmann met them in the square, saluting with the correctness that situations like this demanded. "Herr Oberst. We weren't expecting." "Obviously not, Hauptmann," Vogel interrupted. Given that your demolition appears not to have progressed at all since you received the order. He gestured at the intact buildings surrounding them. I see no evidence of preparation. No charges placed. No equipment staged. Nothing. There was no point in lying. Vogel could see the truth plainly. Hartmann stood straight, hands at his sides. No, sir. The demolition has not begun. And why not? This was the moment. The choice crystallized into words that couldn't be taken back. Hartmann met Vogel's eyes. Because I judged the order to be militarily pointless and morally indefensible, sir. The military police moved their hands to their holsters. The Feldgendarmerie captain stepped forward. But Vogel held up one hand, stopping them. That's quite a judgment, Hauptmann. On what basis? The Americans will be here within hours. Destroying this town won't delay them. It won't harm their advance. It serves no military purpose whatsoever. It would simply render 847 German civilians homeless for no strategic gain. The order comes from the Führer's directive. All territory we cannot hold is to be denied to the enemy. The Führer isn't here, sir. I am. And I can see that this order makes no sense. It was the most dangerous thing Hartmann had said yet. In March 1945, questioning the Führer's wisdom was grounds for immediate execution. Officers had been shot for less. Vogel's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. You understand you're confessing to treason, Vogel said quietly. I understand I'm confessing to disobedience, sir. Whether that constitutes treason, others will have to judge. Major Brenner stepped forward then, aligning himself beside Hartmann. Then Lieutenant Weber. Then Sergeant Kessler. One by one, the officers of the 416th moved to stand with their commander, a silent testimony that this had been a collective choice. The Feldgendarmerie captain seemed eager to begin making arrests, but Vogel silenced him with a glance. The Oberst walked slowly around the square, looking at the buildings, the civilians who watched nervously from windows, the soldiers who stood at attention but with tension evident in every line of their bodies. I've been a soldier for 32 years, Vogel said finally. I was at Verdun in the last war. I've seen what it means to destroy our own country. He stopped in front of Hartmann. I've also seen what happens to officers who disobey orders, no matter how insane those orders might be. I understand the consequences, sir. Do you? Do you understand that I could have you shot within the hour? That I could execute every officer here and replace you with men who would follow orders? Yes, sir. Vogel was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to the Feldgendarmerie captain. Captain, you will report to Corps that the 416th has substantially completed demolition preparations. Minor details remain, but the town's military value has been neutralized. The captain stared. Sir, that's not accurate. Nothing has been. Are you questioning my observation, Captain? The threat in Vogel's voice was unmistakable. The Feldgendarmerie officer stiffened, recognizing authority he couldn't challenge. No, sir. Good. Then that will be your report. The 416th will withdraw across the Rhine tonight, as scheduled. The Americans can have this town intact. God knows they'll need somewhere to sleep. He looked back at Hartmann. You're a fool, Hauptmann. A dangerous fool who could have gotten everyone here killed. But you're also right. And I'm too old to shoot men for being right. He turned to leave, then paused. When this war is over, and it will be over soon, someone will have to answer for what we've done. Someone will have to explain why we followed orders that made no sense, destroyed what we were meant to protect, sacrificed everything for nothing. I would rather not have to explain this town. The staff car drove away, leaving silence in its wake. Hartmann realized he had been holding his breath. Around him, his officers were doing the same. They had been moments from execution. Now they stood free, still alive, the town still intact. What just happened? Weber asked quietly. A miracle, Brenner said. Or possibly a sign that even Corps headquarters has stopped believing. That afternoon, the 416th began their withdrawal. They moved in good order, professional soldiers executing a difficult maneuver with the competence born of 4 years of practice. They took their wounded, their equipment, their wounded pride. What they left behind was a town that would stand. Before departing, Hartmann walked through Breitenbach one final time. He passed the church where he'd kept vigil, the square where his men had drilled, the homes where they'd been billeted. Civilians watched from doorways, not waving, not cheering, but acknowledging. An old man nodded. A woman crossed herself. A child raised one small hand. Frau Eisner was standing by the well. She met Hartmann's eyes, and he saw something there he hadn't expected, not gratitude, but recognition. An understanding that what had happened here mattered in ways beyond military strategy or tactical advantage. Some choices, her expression seemed to say, define who we are. Thank you for the bread, Hartmann said. Thank you for the mercy, she replied. The 416th crossed the Rhine that night. Behind them, American forces entered Breitenbach the next morning, finding a town intact, its people alive, its buildings unburned. The Americans established a headquarters in the same town hall Hartmann had used, slept in the same homes, drew water from the same wells. The war continued around them. Berlin burned. Dresden had already fallen into ash. Hamburg lay in ruins. Across Germany, the scorched earth policy was being implemented with varying degrees of enthusiasm or reluctance. Some towns were destroyed completely. Some were spared by officers who found ways to delay or disobey. Some were saved by the speed of the Allied advance that made demolition impossible. But Breitenbach stood. And standing, it became something more than just one town. It became a question. The court-martial never came. In the chaos of Germany's final collapse, the paperwork was lost or ignored. Officers who might have pressed charges were themselves facing prosecution for war crimes. Corps headquarters dissolved. The Reich itself ceased to exist. Captain Franz Hartmann surrendered to American forces near Frankfurt in late April 1945, expecting to face punishment for his disobedience. Instead, he found himself processed like any other prisoner of war, held briefly, then released. No one seemed interested in what had happened at Breitenbach. The Allies had more pressing concerns: millions of displaced persons, cities to rebuild, war criminals to prosecute. One captain who had saved a town rather than burning it didn't seem worth investigating. Hartmann returned to civilian life in 1946. He became a schoolteacher in Bavaria, never speaking publicly about the war until he was in his 60s. Then, prompted by a student's question about whether soldiers always followed orders, he told the story simply, without embellishment or self-justification. He had been given an order that made no sense. He had disobeyed it. The town had survived. That was all. The student pressed him. But weren't you afraid? Couldn't they have executed you? Of course I was afraid, Hartmann said. But I was more afraid of what I would become if I followed that order. Fear of death is powerful. Fear of dishonor is stronger. Other members of the 416th found their own ways forward. Major Brenner discovered his wife and daughter had survived the war, refugees in Denmark. He reunited with them in 1947 and never wore a uniform again. Lieutenant Weber became a pastor, finding in theology the moral framework military service had failed to provide. Sergeant Kessler returned to his trade as a carpenter, helping rebuild the towns the war had destroyed. They didn't organize reunions or form veterans associations. What had happened at Breitenbach remained unspoken between them, a shared memory that needed no rehearsing. But in 1973, when the town erected a memorial to all who had died in the wars, they were invited to attend. The three surviving officers stood quietly as the mayor spoke of mercy, of choices made in desperate times, of soldiers who had remembered their humanity when ordered to forget it. You saved our town, the mayor said, addressing them directly. More importantly, you saved yourselves. You chose correctly when correct choices were rare. For that, we honor you. Hartmann, 70 years old and wearing an ordinary suit rather than the uniform he'd discarded decades before, struggled to find words. Finally he said only, we simply remembered who we were supposed to be serving. The story of the 416th's refusal began to circulate in military ethics classes in the 1980s. It appeared in textbooks about military law, usually as a footnote illustrating the tension between obedience and conscience. Professors debated whether Hartmann had acted heroically or had simply gotten lucky that Oberst Vogel chose not to enforce regulations. Students wrote papers arguing both sides. But in Breitenbach itself, no debate was necessary. The town knew what had happened. Every building that stood had been saved by a decision made in a moment of moral clarity. The church where Hartmann kept vigil still held services. The bridge he refused to destroy still carried traffic. The homes he wouldn't burn still housed families. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a journalist tracked down Hartmann, now 92 and living in a retirement home. She wanted to write about his act of resistance, to celebrate him as a hero who had stood against Nazi orders. Hartmann refused the characterization. "I was no resistance fighter," he said. "I was a Wehrmacht officer who followed orders for 4 years, who participated in a criminal regime, who only at the very end, when it hardly mattered anymore, finally saw clearly enough to refuse. Don't make me a hero. I was simply a man who, once, didn't do the wrong thing. That's not heroism. That's the bare minimum of human decency." The journalist persisted. "But you risked your life." "I risked less than the people we fought against risked every day," Hartmann interrupted. "The real heroes were those who resisted from the beginning. I'm just an old man who delayed one order near the end of a lost war. I don't deserve medals for that." But the people of Breitenbach disagreed. When Hartmann died in 1998 at age 95, the town flew its flags at half-mast. The mayor spoke at his funeral about the debt a community owed to a soldier who had chosen conscience over command. They buried him in the town cemetery, his grave marked simply with his name and dates, no military insignia. The question Hartmann's actions raised never really resolved. Military organizations around the world still struggle with it. When does disobedience become duty? When does following orders become complicity? When must a soldier refuse? The answers remain as complex as human nature itself. What remains clear is this: on March 17, 1945, in a small town in the Moselle Valley, a group of tired soldiers chose mercy when they could have chosen destruction. They disobeyed when obedience would have been easier. They risked death to preserve life. And in doing so, they demonstrated that even in the machinery of total war, even in the final desperate months of a criminal regime, individual conscience could still matter. The 416th Grenadier Battalion was ultimately just one unit among thousands. Their choice affected one town among hundreds. But that one town still stands. The people who would have been made homeless weren't. The buildings that would have burned didn't. In the vast calculus of World War II's destruction, 60 million dead, countless cities destroyed, entire nations reshaped, one preserved town seems almost insignificant. But to the 847 people who lived there, significance measured differently. To Frau Eisner and her children, to the old men who had already lost one war, to the families who watched Wehrmacht soldiers pack their equipment and march away leaving mercy in their wake, the preservation of Breitenbach wasn't insignificant. It was everything. And perhaps that's the real legacy of the Quiet Mutiny. Not that it changed the war's outcome, it didn't. Not that it altered military policy, it couldn't. Not even that it saved one specific town, though it did that. The real legacy is the reminder that even in systems designed to eliminate individual choice, choice remains. Even in wars meant to destroy humanity, humanity persists. Even when orders demand we become something less than human, we can refuse. Captain Franz Hartmann never claimed to be special. He insisted until his death that he had simply done what anyone would do if they thought clearly about it. But the historical record suggests otherwise. Most officers followed the scorched-earth orders. Most towns were burned. Most soldiers obeyed. Hartmann and the 416th didn't. And in not obeying, they demonstrated something that both the Nazi regime and the total war it waged tried hard to destroy, the idea that some choices are more important than survival. That some orders cannot be followed. That at some fundamental level, we remain responsible for what we do, regardless of who commanded us to do it. The last time Major Brenner spoke about Breitenbach publicly was in 1989, near the end of his life. He was asked what he would want people to remember about that March day in 1945. "Remember that we weren't heroes," he said. "We were cowards who finally found a tiny measure of courage. Remember that we followed criminal orders for years before we finally refused one. Remember that we were part of a machine that destroyed millions before we decided to save 800. Remember all of that. But also remember this: when the moment came to choose between destroying or preserving, between following orders or following conscience, we chose correctly. Once. Finally. Almost too late. But we chose. That choice echoes still in the streets of Breitenbach, in the homes that were never burned, in the lives that continued uninterrupted by a destruction that never came. It echoes in classrooms where military ethics are debated, in courtrooms where superior orders are weighed against human responsibility, in the quiet moments when anyone in authority must decide whether to obey or refuse. The quiet mutiny of the 416th Grenadier Battalion didn't end a war. But it preserved a town. And in preserving that town, it preserved something else, the stubborn human capacity to see clearly, judge correctly, and choose mercy even when every structure of authority demands the opposite. Some victories are measured in territory captured or battles won. Others are measured in what remains standing when the war is over, not just buildings and bridges, but the possibility that humans can remain human even in humanity's darkest hours. Breitenbach still stands. And standing, it remembers.